the recording going. So good afternoon and welcome to SABR Chicago. We are honored to have two fantastic authors speaking about their books today. So we're going to have SABR's board president, Mark Armour, lead off, and then we're going to follow that up with Jason Cannon speaking about his new book, Charlie Murphy. And I know that, Mark, you had mentioned you've already been presenting on this book this morning, and Jason, it sounded like from what you posted on Twitter, you have a full day ahead of you as well. So glad to fit us in. Glad you're able to fit us into your busy schedule today. So without further ado, let's start. So I'm going to introduce Mark Armour. He was elected as SABR's president in 2019 after joining the board as a director in 2018. He's been a SABR member since 1983 and was the founder and longtime director of SABR's Baseball Biography Project. He was the recipient of the Bob Davids Award in 2018 and the Henry Chadwick Award in 2014. His book, Joe Cronin, A Life in Baseball, was a finalist for the Seymour Medal in 2011, as was In Pursuit of Pennants, which he co-wrote with Dan Levitt, who is on this call. So I want to do a quick shout out to you. In 2015, he has written and co-written several other books and many articles for publication, including the most recent book, which we'll be speaking about in a few minutes. He is also co-founder and co-chair of SABR's Baseball Card Committee, past president of the Northwest Chapter, and editor of SABR's 2016 Seattle Convention Journal. So without further ado, Mark.
Yeah, hi there. Dan, I want to mention Dan Levitt is here as well. He also co-wrote this book. So I want to make sure he can help answer some of the questions that I'm not going to be able to answer if you guys have some later. Am I going to be able to share my screen? It looks like I can. I'm going to try this, see if this works. I just have a handful of slides, so I will see if I can. Am I sharing? Is that working? Yes, it is. Okay. Good. So just, briefly, so this is the cover of the book that I just wanted to introduce. So the excuse for me being invited is that Dan and I recently co-wrote this book. It just came out a couple months ago. We've really enjoyed talking to people about it. One of the selfish benefits of the pandemic is that everyone got really comfortable using Zoom, and there's been a lot more ability for people to horn in on other people's chapters, which has allowed us to talk to other chapters. And of course, I know many of you, so this is obviously a pleasant experience for me. So this book came out just a couple months ago, like I said, and I'm just going to briefly talk about sort of what the point of the book is. So let's see if I can get this to work. Okay, I'm going to go through some of the key points that I hope will explain the book in a small amount of time before I get into something a little more substantial. We start out in the introduction, we talk about this guy named Rogers Hornsby, who used to play in Chicago, of course, a great all-time second baseman and hitter 100 years ago. And he, in about 50 years ago, or 60 years ago, I guess, in the 1960s, he was still around, and he wrote a book and an article for publication where he essentially said that he'd been in baseball for 50 years and that every baseball game he was ever involved in, there was cheating. And then he went on to explain what he meant by that, and gave all kinds of examples of all the cheating that he had witnessed, or at least all the cheating that he could fit in the chapter. And I thought this was, or we thought that this was a good place to sort of start, because Hornsby was not saying baseball. This was not a barb at baseball. In fact, just the opposite. He was saying that cheating was part of baseball. And if you wanted to be on his team, you had to be willing to cheat. If you were somebody who was reluctant to cheat or was uncomfortable with cheating, then you could go play in a church league. But in professional baseball, this was kind of how you had to play. So that's Hornsby. And then what we discovered, of course, is that a lot of what he describes as cheating is in fact cheating, but you probably will feel differently about some of the things than you do about others. Like you probably feel differently about a catcher framing a pitch than you do about someone stealing, hacking into the database of the Houston Astros. And of course, we do treat those differently, right? In the first one there's really no effect other than people complaining on Twitter. And the second one caused a guy to go to jail for almost 4 years. So there is a difference between different forms of cheating. And so Hornsby talks about that. He talks about people, modifying the mound to help their pitcher. He talks about, the neighborhood play in baseball where, you didn't touch the base on double play. And he talks about corking a bat and modifying a ball. So he talks about a lot of things. And I think if anyone read this article, they would say, well, that's really bad, or, that's not so bad, which I think is part of the fun of this project, is that we have to deal with the fact that you have rules and people know that what the rules are, those rules are broken, and we are okay with some of that and not okay with others of that. So how we define cheating is essentially that you are knowingly breaking a rule that everyone agrees is a rule, and you do so in order to help yourself or your team. And presumably helping yourself will help your team. So we did that in some ways because we didn't want this book to be about like the Black Sox, right? Who obviously broke rules, but they didn't really help their team. They were doing it they had a different motivation. We really are talking about people that are trying to get more wins for their team. And there are, of course, a lot of ways to do that. So if you do any of those things by our reasoning, you're cheating. Now, we're not necessarily, as you will see when you read the book, we agree that some of it is bad and some of it is not so bad. And that's sort of the fun of it. So we define something in the book called the consensual ethic, and that really is the understanding that within the game, umpires, managers, players kind of all agree on the rules they want enforced. I'll give you sort of a example on one end of the extreme, which is that it is clearly defined in the rule book that there are boxes that have to be drawn on the field where the first and third base coaches must stand. And that is a rule, and there are penalties for violating that rule. And I think that if you go to watch the Cubs or the White Sox later today, you will find that no one ever stands in the box, or hardly ever stands in the box. And so that's a rule that everyone has kind of agreed that, without actually writing it down, that it's just not going to be called. It's not going to be enforced. Much like if you drive on the highway, you don't really want to be pulled over for driving 2 miles per hour over the speed limit. And I think the cops agree that they don't want to do that, and your fellow drivers agree that they don't want everyone that to happen. It's not written down, but everyone has in their head this view that if they drive on the highway, well, 5 miles per hour of the speed limit is okay, but 20, you actually want the guy to get pulled over. And baseball has this understanding that is kind of built up over time that you only can see if you actually study how these rules are enforced or not enforced. I wrote this sort of to be provocative, but one of the basic themes of our book, the subtitle of our book, which is not in front of me at the moment, is that there's a fine line between innovation and cheating. That the teams that are the smartest are often the teams, or the players that are the smartest are often the ones that are getting caught up in in shenanigans. And this came to mind because of the Astros, who, of course, one of the prime motivators for us starting on this book was the Astros scandal, which came out in early 2020. Well, what the Astros were famous for the day before the scandal came to light was that they were the smartest front office in baseball. And now they're famous for something else. And it struck us that, well, there's probably a correlation over time. I mean, Branch Rickey is probably considered the smartest general manager of all time, and probably the best general manager of all time, but he is also very obviously cheated. He signed players he wasn't allowed to sign. He had farm teams he wasn't allowed to have in leagues. He had tacit agreements with one minor league affiliate to hide players for him, and eventually he was caught, and Judge Landis, who was the commissioner, freed a bunch of players from the Cardinals when he was running the Cardinals. So he knew the rule, he broke the rule, he did so in order to help his team, but everybody agrees that he was great in many other ways, and he's more or less gotten a pass. But so we've kind of we write throughout the book about people that are sort of on the cutting edge of trying to get a little bit better, a little bit more information. And the Astros are a perfect example of a team that said, well, if there's going to be sign stealing going on, which there absolutely was before the Astros ever came around, we are going to figure out a way to do this the smartest, best way that anyone's ever invented. And that is more or less what they did, as far as we know. I mean, their penalty was that they were really better at it than anyone had ever been before, essentially, or their crime. And this I also intended to be provocative. If you play pickup basketball, I played a lot of pickup basketball when I was young, and everyone knew that that calling someone competitive was kind of a good thing up to a point. You wouldn't want someone to be that competitive. And the baseball players that you're watching on TV are the most competitive people you've ever interacted with, right? They're the most competitive basketball player you ever played with, except there's 25 of them, and they're even more competitive than that. So it's just more likely that they're going to be looking to find an edge. And we are not suggesting and we don't suggest in the book that smart people cheat or competitive people cheat, but only that you're more likely to face that line, that should I or shouldn't I line, if you're looking to push to the edge. And if you were a relatively uncompetitive, or maybe not uncompetitive is the wrong word, but just a mediocre, not really smart kind of manager, you're less likely to face this situation and therefore less likely to cheat. So we don't believe that baseball players are unethical. They are human and they're competitive, and this is the way competitive humans behave generally. I think this is true probably in other sports. There are more rules in baseball, and therefore there are more ways to break them. But I don't think that we do not believe that baseball players are more likely to be unethical in other ways than the people that you deal with in your ordinary life. And also, we love baseball. So I want to say that because I have had a few people that said, why are you saying this about baseball? Essentially, so I want to defend ourselves right up front that this is a very positive book. We're historians and we love the stories, and we definitely think that this makes baseball more interesting, not less interesting. Okay, so yeah, we have a lot of fun quotes that we have that essentially try and tell our story for us. Jim Russo, who is a longtime scout for the Orioles, who essentially made a point that we essentially make, which is that he sort of believes that, part of our job is to cheat because everyone else is cheating. So if we're not cheating, then we're going to fall behind, and we're cheating our fans. And he's not the only person that said that. He just said it in an interesting way for us. John McGraw was, again, probably at the time thought of as the smartest guy in baseball, both when he played, which was in the 1890s, largely at Baltimore, but then when he managed for 30 years with the Giants, he was always the guy that was considered to be one step ahead of everybody else. And he explained that very succinctly here, that he essentially implies here that his job was to read the rule book and find loopholes. Like, what can I exploit? And oftentimes he would find a way to exploit the rules, and then the rule makers would come along and they would plug the hole, and then he'd have to find another loophole. You probably remember Earl Weaver, who not long after the designated hitter was implemented in 1973, he discovered that, well, what he was going to do is he was going to start at designated hitter a pitcher who, like, maybe he was last night's pitcher. So he did that in order to not commit to who the DH was until the spot came up in the order. So if the DH was hitting seventh, it might be the second or third inning. And maybe he might even have a situation where the starting pitcher is changed, or the pitcher on the mound is changed from a left-handed pitcher to right-handed pitcher. That's unusual, but it could happen. Or he might need a bunt, or whatever. And then after he did that one season, they changed the rule so that the DH now has to bat one time. Roger Angell, we didn't find this quote until after our book came out, but for those of you who are old enough, you may remember that Jason probably remembers this badly, but in the 1978 World Series, there was a play on the bases where Reggie Jackson, in order to keep the Dodgers from turning a double play, he was the runner on first base, and he just stopped in the middle of the base path and then stuck his hip out and took the ball that was being thrown, I think maybe from Davey Lopes, and it deflected off his hip and then rolled out of play, and the Yankees scored a run or two on that play. They ended up going into extra innings. Undoubtedly, if the game had played out, the Yankees would have lost that game. I think it was game 3 that already lost the first 2 games. So I think it was considered to be a fairly big moment in the series. And Roger Angell wrote about it in the New Yorker afterwards and essentially said, I want guys like Reggie Jackson to do what he did. I admire people who are looking for that advantage. And of course, Jackson, whatever Jackson did, and you can see the replay, he had to do this in a tenth of a second. He had a very small amount of time to react. And I don't think mere humans would have thought of it fast enough. And Reggie did. So Angell was saying, hat tip to him. So here are the things we talk about in the book, just to give you the broad strokes. The first chapter is deception, which is about gamesmanship kind of things like catcher framing and the neighborhood play and other things where you're really trying to fool the umpire. Espionage, that's probably the most serious crime in recent baseball history, was when the Cardinals scouting director, farm director was caught hacking into the Astros system. That's like true corporate espionage. Penny nails and cork is about the bat, corking the bat. Roster shenanigans is like the stuff I just talked about with Branch Rickey, but that's going on today as well, all the way up until today. The Braves general manager John Capabella was put on baseball's ineligible list forever for his illegal schemes to sign foreign players to larger than allowed bonuses. Juice is about steroids. I think I'm doing this maybe in the wrong order, but Binoculars and Telescopes is about early sign stealing, pre-video, and then the smartwatches is the more modern sign stealing. Rakes and Hoses is the stuff that people do to the to the grounds, pitcher's mound, base paths, etc. If you went to the SABR convention, this is what I talked about. Essentially, this issue that Bill Veeck was pretty famous for. Greenies is amphetamines, which were pretty popular in baseball when I was a kid. It kind of got overtaken by steroids in terms of its importance in the press, but I think still lasted until they finally started to test for it. And then Grease and Glue is the pitcher. And that's, of course, goes back to the 1890s as well. So I'm going to talk just a little bit more about that. This is the final chapter in the book, which is about the pitcher. And I have three pitchers up here you may recognize. Gaylord Perry, who is most famous for putting lubrication on the ball, and Garrett Cole in the lower right is most famous for putting sticky stuff on the ball, and Whitey Ford, top right, who was famous especially after his career. He wasn't really famous during his career, but after his career, for stuffing the ball. And I talk about this to some extent in the book, that that a true overhand fastball, a four-seam fastball, is thrown to maximum effect by putting your two fingers across the four seams, and the ball comes to you with a backspin. And we now know, in ways that none of these three gentlemen knew, precisely how fast a pitch is going, and also how much it spins. We can measure that. When I say we, I mean, the Major League Baseball, they all have the tools to do that. And Rapsodo is a lab up in Seattle that pitchers can go to, and or they can get their own equipment to measure all of the mechanics of their pitch, so they can get the pitch to do, to practice all possible grips, all possible motions, to see what they can get the ball to do. So the three ways you can cheat with the baseball are represented by these three people. If you put lubrication in the ball like Perry did, the effect is to reduce the rotation on the ball, and therefore it will actually drop fairly substantially on its way to the plate, which is what Perry wanted. If you put sticky stuff on the ball like Cole, and you throw a four-seam fastball, you're going to get more rotation, and therefore it's going to resist gravity longer and go faster, and also drop less. So they call it a rising fastball. In fact, it just drops less than other fastballs. I always knew that fastballs didn't rise, because the weird Cole is releasing that pitch is higher than the top of the strike zone. So you wouldn't want it to rise, actually, but you just want it to drop less than the hitter's eyes is going to think. And then what Ford did, and what many, many other people, I'm not really picking on these three people, they're just avatars. What Ford was sort of famous for was getting the ball to do, to essentially dive in one direction or the other, depending on where he was stuffing the ball. And these three types of doctoring are often lumped together as like a spitball or something, but in fact they're really three different things and three different goals. All of these things were done as early as, say, 1905. The first spitballer, or there's some dispute about who the first spitballer was, but it came to the major leagues by the early 20th century with people like Jack Chesbrough and Ed Walsh and Eddie Saccott and many others. There were many people who were famous for not just throwing the spitball, but throwing the spitball on literally every single pitch. And there were people that experimented with putting sticky stuff on the ball, certainly by the 19-teens. Johnny Evers wrote about that in his book that came out, I guess, in around 1910 or so. The pitchers were doing this. And we know people scuffed the ball. Russ Ford was a pitcher for the Yankees in the early teens, who was famous for putting essentially a piece of sandpaper in his glove and using that to scuff a ball. All this stuff was legal for a time. I think they first eliminated they used to throw out baseballs that had been marred, like what Ford was doing, pre-Whitey, Russ I'm talking about, but Whitey too. But then eventually in 1920, of course, they outlawed all of it. So all of this stuff became cheating in 1920. And of course, it kept going, even though it was cheating. And I should say, in 1920 is also the year that the Negro National League was founded, and they said they were going to use the same rule book as the American League and National League did, and that included the spitball. So the spitball was technically illegal in the Negro Leagues from the beginning. They also grandfathered the old spitballers in, so the people who threw the spitball could keep throwing the spitball. But they had just as many problems with the spitball, maybe even more, than the American and National League did, in terms of no one really believing that it had stopped. It certainly slowed down. There wasn't a lot of stories about the spitball until the 50s, but I don't think anyone believes that it stopped. There was probably one of the first big exposés about it was Preacher Rothe, who the pitcher for the Dodgers, who at the end of his career, I think he may have actually just retired, he sold a story to Sports Illustrated in which he admitted that he'd thrown the spitball for the last, say, 5 years, like his entire Dodger career. He later backpedaled a little bit, but not really that much. And most of the other Dodgers that they talked to, including Campanella, who was his catcher, sort of said, yeah, he probably did. But I think what Campanella said was, I've had to bat against more spitballs than I've had to catch. And this included his time in the Negro Leagues, when he said that's how he learned to both hit a spitball and also catch a spitball, was when he was playing for the elite Giants. So if Rothe did anything, he just kind of shone a light on something that was happening. He wasn't really new in throwing the spitball. He was just new in admitting that he was throwing the spitball. Because over the years, I mean, after people retired, then there were more people that were willing to admit it. Lou Burdett was another guy who was accused throughout his career, and then after his career was over safely, he would occasionally admit, sort of jokingly about what he got away with and whatnot. By the time I came along as a fan, by the late 60s and throughout the 70s, of course, the spitball was huge story, largely due to the man on the left, Gaylord Perry, who wrote a book about it in the mid 70s called Me and the Spitter. And it was a traditional sort of shucks autobiography, except that he admitted how he did it, when he first did it, which was when he was pitching for the Giants, and he was like the 10th man on a 10-man staff, barely getting into games. There was a doubleheader in Shea Stadium that Perry got to get in because I don't know if it was the first or second game, but it was a game that ended up going 24 innings, and Perry came in like the 12th inning and pitched like 9 or 10 innings in the game because they were kind of desperate. They'd run out of pitchers. And at one point, I think Perry was on the mound, and the manager, everyone knew that he had been experimenting with a spitball. And I don't know if it was the catcher, who was probably Tom Holler, or the manager, it would have been Al Dark, basically said, if you've got one, this is the time, right? And so Perry sort of described it. It was a very funny book, but it was clear that he described it as sort of a desperation move. Like he needed to perform, and this was his chance. And then Perry, of course, became a phenomenal pitcher, and by most accounts, he was a phenomenal pitcher even without the spitball. He had grown into somebody who threw a lot of great pitches, a fastball, high slider, etc. But he was famous for the spitball all the way to the end. He was finally kicked out of a game for it. They kept passing rules to make it a little bit harder for him, but he wasn't actually punished for it until he was on the Mariners in 1982. So he would have been like in his early 40s at that point. Just to show you how little people cared about the spitball. When I say cared about, I mean in terms of punishing it. Until 1968, you were allowed to do anything you wanted on the mound. You could like lick your fingers on the mound, and that was not a violation. There was nothing in the rule that said you couldn't. You basically had to like wipe your fingers off. But of course, I mean, how hard is that to do? They finally changed the rule that you couldn't do that. You could no longer put your fingers to your mouth. I think for a while it was unless you walked off the mound, which again is just another rule that's easy to exploit. Anyway, Perry did that. There's a lot of other people that were famous for doing stuff with the ball in his time, including Don Drysdale, certainly Burdett, Bob Shaw. By the time Perry was a star, there was probably a spitballer or two on basically every team. And for the most part, it was one of their pitches. It wasn't like Ed Walsh, who was just through the spitball. And this stayed the status quo, and probably until the 80s. And a lot of people claim the demise of the true lubrication ball was the split-fingered fastball, which became the pitch of the 80s. That Roger Craig was the pitching coach of the Tigers that kind of taught everybody that, and then he became the manager of the Giants. And the reason why that killed the spitter was just because it did what the spitter did. I mean, the point of what the split-fingered fastball did was it dove late, and that's what you wanted to do with the spitball. So people started doing that instead. So I don't think it became much less common after that. People kept scuffing balls. Certainly, you probably have seen the video of Joe Niekro with the Twins, who was caught on the mound. This again, I think it was the very end of Niekro's career. He was caught on the mound with a nail file. There was another Dodger, Jay Howe, I think it was, who was caught scuffing pitches in the playoffs in the National League in the late 80s. So it certainly continued with the scuffing for a while, and then it became a much bigger story in recent times because of people actually doing the opposite of the spitball, which is to get more grip on the ball. That's become the problem of the time, is not less grip, which Perry wanted, but more. And that happened, of course, that blew open last year when Major League Baseball decided to cut down on it. And they started inspecting last June. And the difference I want to stress is that it was in and this is the innovation angle, it was in about 2015 that pitchers, or all of us, had available to us for the first time the ability to track spin rate and precise vertical and horizontal movement on every pitch they threw. So pitchers could, I think Whitey Ford believed what he was doing was working, but he didn't have any data to back it up. Whereas, and by 2015, and then within a few years, all pitchers had what they needed to back it up. They knew that if they put a little dab of Elmer's glue on their thumb, they knew what would happen because they could test it. They could go to a lab and they could test it. So pitchers began to experiment with this, and sort of famously, Trevor Bauer, who became more famous later, but for a time, probably his biggest claim to fame was that he was the person that talked about this. You know, he's always been somebody who likes to talk, and he would explain to reporters that the only way you can get spin rates more than some number, 2,300 or whatever it was, is to cheat. There's no other way to do it. There's no way the human hand can make a baseball go more than this. And then he had a start where he essentially said, like, watch me tonight. And in the first inning of his start, he got these absurd spin rates. And then he basically the reporters asked him about it later, and he just kind of winked at him and said, well, what'd I tell you? And what he was doing by inference was accusing the pitchers who were getting these newly high spin rates, including Garrett Cole and Justin Verlander, and I can't remember who else, but it was a handful of pitchers that had gotten pretty high spin rates very recently. Charlie Morton, there was a few that were associated with the Astros. Imagine that, around this time. And you know, he was the guy who said it was happening, and then all the stat nerds that deal with StatCast numbers began tracking it, and they began noticing when pitchers would have a spike, and they would say, "Hey, why did this guy have a spike?" And they would ask him about it, and the guy would say, "I don't know what you're talking about." And eventually, you know, they caught a guy in Anaheim who in the clubhouse that was giving substances to pitchers that was a sticky concoction, and they got some names, and they investigated, and they figured out what was going on, and they began the crackdown last June. So the story of this is very much the story of all the other cheating scandals that we've run across before, which is like pitchers or batters or people in the front office figuring out a way to get better, and a long period of understanding that this was maybe working but not worth panicking over. And then after some period of time, like with sign stealing, like with the pitchers, baseball saying, like, you know, it's gotten out of hand now. We need to do something. This is not new in the sense that Garrett Cole is no more guilty of rule breaking than Gaylord Berry was, but in Cole's case, the pitching was kind of getting out of whack, and it came hand in hand with all the criticism that baseball has gotten in recent years about all the strikeouts, the reduced balls in play, people not wanting to sit through, you know, long games with so many batters that, you know, are unable to hit these wiffle ball like pitchers. And baseball, I think, reacted to that. And there is some evidence, by the way, that it worked for a time, but the spin rates seem to be going back up again, at least with certain pitches. So I think this is always going to be a little bit of a cat and mouse game. I think that pitchers are going to find something else, or find some other way to get away with it, or find another way to get the spin. And baseball is going to have to figure out how to deal with it. assuming they do want to deal with it. Because for a time, the answer was, we don't need to deal with it. And now they're dealing with it. And that's the same story with sign stealing, same story with the pitchers, the cork bats, everything. It's like, it's a big story when it appears that it's changing the game in a way that we don't want. So that's what I have to say. I would be happy to take questions about any of the stuff I talked about. And Dan could obviously chime in as well. It was a really fun subject. I loved working on it. I learned a lot myself. I learned not just the stories, but I also learned that how I felt about it all wasn't the way I thought I felt about it all. And maybe that shows me that I'm still a work in progress, perhaps, which is, I guess, a good thing. I think that, I'm guessing that's going to be true of most people who read it, that they might think, certainly some of the people that I talked to as I was working on the book would start out by saying, all cheating is bad, we shouldn't allow any of it, this is ridiculous. And then as we have conversations, they're like, well, okay, that's okay, that should be allowed. So we all have our, I mean, we're all human, we all want honesty, we all want everybody to behave in a fair way, and we all, I think, have some basic understanding that not everyone's perfect, including ourselves. And I think baseball is just has had some success and some not success dealing with all of that over the years, and I expect there's more to come.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. So yeah, if you have a question, why don't you unmute yourself? We'll take a couple of minutes before we jump over to Jason, but I will maybe just jump in right away with my question to one of your last comments. Maybe going through the process, you found that you have different feelings. Can you give us an example of where maybe you had strong feelings and found out it was a little bit more of a gray area for you?
I guess if I make a comment like that, I have to be ready for that very obvious question. Well, let's see. I think one of the areas, and I almost hesitate to bring this up because it's probably the biggest controversy, biggest cheating controversy of our lifetimes, which is steroids. I've always been uncomfortable with the way we deal with that because it's very much a scarlet letter thing, where I think I'm uncomfortable with the fact that we that at the before there was testing, we caught some people, but not very many of them, and we kind of have become sort of happy, sort of worshiping the ones that didn't get caught and hating the ones who did. I'm uncomfortable with that, and I'll just speak for myself. I'm uncomfortable with myself thinking that. I'm uncomfortable with the fact that we have, punishments, but really many of us really want these punishments to be lifetime punishments. Like, it's not like you can serve the time that we've agreed you should serve and then everything's okay. It's sort of like, well, you can still play baseball, but we're going to hate you forever. I think that is true with steroids, and it is not true with other types of cheating. It's certainly not true with Gaylord Perry, who, by the way, I like a lot. I mean, he was just, I think his story is fun. I think he's fun. And I also, and this is, I don't want to take the conversation too far down this path because it could get everybody's hackles up, but I'm also like the Tatis thing made me uncomfortable because I want, now that we're in a phase where people are being punished for, we're in a phase where many of us have been prescribed steroids by doctors to after surgery or to recover from, you know, major physical problems. And I'm uncomfortable with the fact that we are now, and Tatis, you know, took his punishment and is not, and is going to serve his time and admitted that he made a mistake. So that's, I'm not disputing any of that. But what I'm disputing is, like, do we want to get to a place as a society where we have athletes that can't come back from injuries because they're not allowed to take the same treatments that you and I would be able to take if we had that injury? One of the people I always wonder about is probably one of the favorite people of probably half the people on this call is Bo Jackson, because Bo Jackson had hip replacement surgery and came back from it. My mother had hip replacement surgery as well, and she was given steroids as part of her recovery from hip replacements. Now, Jackson, I have no idea what he did. I'm not accusing him of anything, but let's say that he did take steroids, because that's what people do to recover from the surgery. This is what doctors want him to do. Do we really want to live in a world where Bo Jackson doesn't get to come back? So that's me. That's what I'm thinking. Like, do you want Bo Jackson to, do you want to tell Bo Jackson, sorry, you can't come back because you, and then just the question is, do we want people to recover from their injuries? You know, I don't know. So that's maybe more than you were asking, but I think this problem that I just mentioned is, in 10 years, is going to be a much bigger problem, because I think medical advances are becoming so extraordinary that, you know, we certainly allow people to get new lenses in their eyes, and we allow people to take ligaments from one part of their body and put it in their elbow, and that's easy compared to what's coming. And I think there's going to be a whole can of worms when we get to the point where we have to decide, not we, but baseball has to decide, and all sports have to decide, do we want these people to use the tools that the medical community has decided are safe and proper? And I don't want anyone to think that, based on what I said, that I know the answer to that, because I don't. I'm just saying, I'm just throwing it out there.
How many any other questions? Feel free, we'll take just a couple of minutes, maybe one or two questions.
Mark, I got a question for you. It's Jason.
Jason.
So obviously the Astros scandal was pretty big. Do you feel like the cheating they did in the World Series somehow taints or puts an asterisk on the Dodgers 2017 World Championship?
I'm going to let Dan answer that.
You know, I mean, my sense is what's in the record book is in the record book, and we can all sort of argue about it and have fun doing it, and there may be some merits to making those things, but it's kind of like, what's the record for home runs, you know, in a single season? And, you know, I mean, to me, the numbers there, it's sort of done. I would just say this for the stuff on the Astros, that clearly Rob Manfred came out in September of 2017 in response to the Apple Watch controversy and said, I mean, from the Red Sox, and said he had a penalty for the Red Sox, which wasn't all that severe, but it was meaningful. But then he said, going forward, if this happens again, we're going to come down on the GM and on the manager, and oh, by the way, don't do this. So I think there was sort of a line drawn in the September of 2017 that anything after that at least from sort of the team perspective, perhaps not from a player perspective, because he couldn't rule on the players. He could really, because they needed a union agreement. Anything from the team perspective, I think, was clearly different than anything that came before it. How you want to view that, I think, is up to you. But I clearly think there was a different line as of September of 2017.
And I would sort of add to that I'm totally okay with, and a lot of my smarter colleagues disagree with me on this, but I'm okay with people saying the Dodgers actually won the 2017 World Series, or Roger Maris is really the home run leader. I mean, I'm okay with that because nothing we say honestly matters. So I feel like all these opinions are fine. In some ways, I kind of embrace the chaos. I think I've told Jason that the 2020 World Series is tainted because they didn't play a full season. Do I really mean that, or am I just jerking his chain? I'll never tell. But it's just kind of the fun of sports. I think myself, I'm trying to take it all less seriously. I watched, Mark McGwire hit his 70th home run. It was really fun. He did steroids. I wish he hadn't. I don't know. I guess I'm kind of like letting anyone decide what they want, which is not a good answer, Jason. I'm sorry.
Perfect. Anybody else? Maybe one more question.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Dan.
It had to do with ball scuffing. It just kind of disappeared like in the late 1980s. I mean, there was this whole thing with the Mets. Like the Mets would, when Mike Scott was pitching, the Mets would get they'd have this big bucket of baseballs that they claimed were scuffed, and they would send it to the National League, and then nothing happened, and Mike Scott kept beating them, and this kept going on. And then all of a sudden it just kind of disappeared. Was that because of the split-fingered fastball or what? It just, it just kind of disappeared. I just wonder what happened there.
I don't have an answer to what happened. We do have a former general manager in the house. Maybe Dan Evans has some memory of what the ball scuffing issue was in the 1980s. He's muted, or he might not even be there. Oh, he's back.
No, I'm here. I wasn't at a high enough level. I was just becoming an assistant GM at that point. I really don't remember much about the ball scuffing of the 80s. It just, there was so many little things going on still from the.
I think he locked up. It'll be a secret forever. Okay.
Well, one of my, and I'll just be brief. One of the coolest. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. You locked up there for a second.
That's all right. Thanks, Dan, for chiming in. The story that I remember, which might be fun for some of you Chicago people, is that in the 2006 World Series, if I have that right, Cardinals-Tigers, the first, I think it was the first game of the World Series, or maybe the second game, Kenny Rogers was pitching for the Tigers, and the cameras sort of zoomed in on him, and he clearly had some kind of substance on his glove, was it, or his sleeve? I forget what it was, but it was very obvious in the cameras, and Tim McCarver was talking about it, and Joe Buck, and somehow the word got down to La Russa, who was managing the Cardinals, and La Russa obviously saw this and said, "Yeah, that's right." And he went out to the umpire, and he called Kenny Rogers over, and Kenny Rogers had to go in and take his shirt off and put a new shirt on. The reason why I think that's funny is that a lot of managers would have not been as nice about this as Larissa was. I mean, maybe that was because his best friend was managing the Tigers. I don't know, but you know, like Billy Martin would have like waited till exactly the right moment and come out and got him kicked out of the game and he would have done the George Brett thing. But Larissa, that was a pretty big deal because that was in the middle of the World Series. But yeah, it kind of died down again until a few years ago.
Great. Well, yeah, we will. Thank you very much, Mark. We really appreciate that. Now, really quickly, if you go to the chat, the very, very first comment, Jason Schwartz entered a link to a Google Doc. We are actually putting together, let me pull that back up again. It says for the Chicago area folks, we're arranging a bulk order for Mark's book. So feel free to click on that link and get your name added to that list. And we will, and Bruce has a copy of the book right there. So Jason, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to chime in on any other details with that before we move along.
Just that I think I'm going to finalize in about 2 days. So don't be too slow if you're sitting on the fence. In about 2 days, I'm going to pay Mark and have him send the books. So
right.
We'll close that sheet in a couple days. The other thing too, though, is, the whole point is kind of save on shipping. So I'll plan to hand deliver at upcoming SABR Chicago meetings, or if you live near me, I'm happy to drive by. If you're like Central Illinois or something like that, I probably won't drive by. So you may have to come to me. But
right.
Yeah, happy to do it. And it's a great opportunity for us. Mark's also offered to sign and personalize. So if you have your name on the spreadsheet, he can do that.
Yeah, that's great. So yeah, so make sure you click on that link before the session ends. So,
and
thank you very much.
Where does Dan live, in case anybody wants to, knock on the door and get the second auto needed to complete the set?
I'm in Minneapolis, so if you're here, happy to help out.
Good work.
Perfect.
So I really appreciate you guys having me on. A lot of friends here, which is great. So always fun to talk baseball on a Saturday. And I told Bill that I'd stick around if you guys have any SABR questions after Jason is done speaking. I'd be happy to answer them as well.
Great. Yeah, well, thank you very much. So our second speaker, Jason Cannon, feel free to unmute yourself. So Jason Cannon worked in collegiate sports information before turning to teaching and writing. His articles have appeared in 9 Journal of Baseball History and Culture. And in his latest book, Charlie Murphy, he explores Murphy's life both on and off the field, painting a picture of his meteoric rise and precipitous downfall. Readers will get to know the real Murphy, not the simplified caricature created by his contemporaries. So I think it's really interesting. I just had the opportunity to finish this book, and obviously you have your presentation lined up, but just a quick question. The era of the Chicago Cubs that he's responsible for, multiple pennants, the 2 World Series that we had for a long time here. So much is known about the team, but it seems like he's a very important character in this whole story that just doesn't seem to be written about. So thanks for writing your book and filling in that gap. I thought it was really insightful. So it's all yours.
Well, I appreciate that, Bill. Thanks a lot. And thanks to everyone for being here today and for the chapter for having me. Yeah, Bill, it's an interesting question. I think one of the things that jumped out to me when I was looking at Murphy's tenure, at least in the early stages, was here he is as the owner of the club for 8 years, 8 full seasons, I should say. They win 4 pennants and 2 World Series titles, never finished below 3rd place. And yet he remains a sort of anonymous figure. And I was thinking, well, I mean, how bad could he have been if in 8 full years, that was the organization's accomplishments? And so that's really where I got very intrigued at looking at not only his tenure there, as part of the front office there, but also his life story. And it really quite an amazing journey for him. One of the things that I'll talk about in just a few minutes was his ability to network was really unparalleled and quite amazing. But yeah, unbelievably successful tenure as owner of the team, but definitely overshadowed by the 4 Hall of Famers on the club. And I think one of the reasons behind Murphy's anonymity, if you will, is not only was his falling out with the National League a big part of it, but I think as time went on, the organization becomes more and more affiliated with the ballpark. And then as the decades move forward, the Cubs are obviously a marquee franchise, but different legends and stories kind of take over from there. And so you have the mythology of the double play combination. You have the mythology of Three Finger Brown, and Murphy didn't really encapsulate anything magical in that regard. And so he ends up being sort of this forgotten figure. But one of the things that I hope that is beneficial in terms of being able to read the book is not just his time with the Cubs, although that's probably the reason why the book's written and why hopefully you all have interest, but it's also a story about a couple other things as well. And that is includes the Irish immigrant experience. Both of Charlie's parents immigrated from Ireland to Ohio, which is a really interesting research piece. Another aspect, obviously the most successful team in Cubs history. That's an intriguing aspect. But then you have a couple other things in Murphy's, the prime of his ownership tenure. And one of them is the developing relationship between organized baseball and the White House. And the Taft family and Charlie Murphy were legitimately very close. It was not a manufactured relationship. It wasn't something where in hindsight, it's a talking point to, create some sort of political connection that wasn't there. They were genuinely close. Charlie was very close with Charles Phelps Taft, as well as his wife, Annie. And Charles Taft, being President Taft's older half brother, a very important political stalwart there in the Midwest. And so these connections were very legitimate. And so what you have is Taft's personal relationship, not just with Charlie Murphy, but with Frank Chance and several of the players, develop over a period of years while he's in the White House. And we've all seen that famous picture of Taft throwing out the first pitch. But really, it was Murphy and Taft, that relationship, that really began to solidify that developing relationship in a new way, particularly after President Roosevelt, who had next to no interest in baseball. So that was a really interesting part of his story as well that I'll touch on in a couple of minutes. And then also you just have the business of baseball, basically the last decade of the 19th century through 1914 when Murphy's ousted. And the business of baseball, much different in those days than it would be today. But one of the things that Murphy did really effectively was pioneer the usage of public relations. And that's something he learned in no small part from John T. Brush, who owned the Reds and then later the Giants. But he himself contributed his own twist, if you will, to the dynamic of public relations. So in talking about the book, I wanted to touch a little bit on those different pieces of Murphy's story. If any of you have any questions throughout, please, by all means, I'd love for it to be a back and forth and discussion with you whenever possible. So if anything comes up, you have a question about anything, please feel free to let me know, and love to dialogue with you instead of just maybe talking to you a little bit throughout the thing and mix it up. But one of the things that I did to start the book, and I'll just read just a quick passage from it, is I used a quote from Hugh Fullerton, or really Hugh Fullerton's relationship with Charlie Murphy to, basically I was thinking, who's going to take my word for it? Kind of the old Reading Rainbow line, you don't have to take my word for it. But I was hoping that you might take Hugh Fullerton's word for it, the Hall of Fame baseball writer who knew Murphy from their teenage years. And Fullerton, upon Murphy's death, wrote these words. He wrote, "He was a showman, a baseball fanatic, a quick-thinking, quicker-acting fellow whose fiery, impulsive temperament kept the entire baseball world bubbling." And so when I read that obituary, I thought, this is a guy I want to learn more about. And he did not let me down. And one of the things I think that really was interesting about Murphy's experience growing up in Wilmington, Ohio, which is about an hour northeast of Cincinnati, is that he built a lot of relationships around baseball, true, but he also built a lot of relationships around getting to know people as he worked at a pharmacy as a drug clerk. And he began to realize that networking was really key to his future from a young age. His father was an alcoholic and really struggled to stay at times in and out of local jails. And so Charlie had to go to work in order to provide for the family. And it was a difficult situation all the way around because his father, Patrick, had immigrated from County Cork, Ireland in the 1850s and had settled in Cincinnati originally as a teenager and learned the trade of plastering. And then when Patrick moved to Wilmington to start his own business, locals started taking to calling him PJ. When PJ started his local business, he got to know everybody around town. And so he worked on commercial buildings, government buildings. He worked on private residences. There was a local judge, Judge West, hired PJ to work on his home. And PJ was very successful around town. But unfortunately, there were a couple of events that really, tragic events that altered the trajectory of PJ's life. One of them was that his business partner, Webb Ferguson, was injured at work. There was an anecdote I didn't put in the book because I could never confirm it, but supposedly he fell off a ladder and hit his head on the ground, and from that day forward struggled to remain mentally balanced and eventually was institutionalized. And so PJ's best friend and business partner, in one accident, one moment of time, essentially the partnership breaks up and the business starts to dissolve. And then not too many years after that, 1864, Patrick or PJ marries Ellen Murray, whose family had also immigrated from Ireland. And then less than a year later, Ellen dies in childbirth. And so he's lost his best friend, his business partner, and his wife in a very short amount of time. And unfortunately, from there, PJ's life really starts to spiral down. So by the time Charlie's born in 1868, PJ's gotten remarried. The family's really on shaky ground. And then as Charlie grows up, he has to step forward and take care of his mother and his younger siblings, which he's happy to do. And so with that as kind of the contextual background of Murphy's early life, he goes to work and at these pharmacies there in town and gets to know people in the neighborhood who come in. People of all ages with all different sorts of needs come in, and he's happy to talk to them. He figures out what's going on around town. And it was always a skill that he had in terms of being extroverted and relationally driven, but it was honed inside these drugstores. And so it was something that he really, from an early stage, intentionally developed, and it would help him incredibly in the decades ahead. When we think about Murphy's early life in Wilmington, there are a couple of things to take note of in terms of baseball. He was a big supporter and played baseball as a young kid. He and his brother would often play against the local college kids. Charlie would catch, he broke fingers, he stuck with it, but he quickly realized that he didn't have the talent to compete with these other players. He just wasn't going to be able to do that. And so from a young age, he really studied the strategy of the game. And as he studied the strategy of the game, he grew to love it on an even deeper level. And so he always found a way to support the local college team financially. And Hugh Fullerton knew this. Fullerton was from Hillsborough, about 20 miles away. And Hillsborough was another small enclave. So Fullerton and Murphy share a lot in common in terms of their background. And so as they both progressed throughout their baseball lives, they always drew upon their mutual connection from small Ohio towns that drew them together. And as Murphy's growing a little bit older, he's realizing, hey, I may not be able to play baseball, but I've really enjoyed getting to know people around town and networking and things of this nature. And he decides to go into journalism. And so he's moving to Cincinnati. He's in his early 20s, and he starts to cover the crime beat in Cincinnati. And again, the same sort of thing takes hold. He gets to know people around town and network, and he's really quite popular. He's a popular journalist. People read his work, and a very interesting figure in that regard. He had a big personality, and everyone knew who he was. And he started to catch the attention of people around town. And one of the really interesting things that I think happened with Murphy's life, you can't make this up, is In the year 1892, he's a young journalist there in Cincinnati, and the Cincinnati Ball Club hires Charlie Comiskey to manage and play first base. And so Murphy and Comiskey meet and start to interact. And then there's another journalist in town by the name of Ban Johnson. And so you have Murphy, Comiskey, and Ban Johnson in Cincinnati in 1892 as young men starting to really ply their trade, whether that's on or off the field. But it had something to do with baseball. That was always part of what Murphy wrote about, in addition to the crime beat. And they get to know each other. And Ban Johnson and Charlie Murphy didn't like each other from the jump, and they never did. And it all stemmed back from those early years in the 1890s. And one of the reasons why Ban Johnson and Charlie didn't get along very well was John T. Brush. John T. Brush owned the Reds, and Ban Johnson used to criticize him in the papers pretty frequently. And so, of course, you all are going to be familiar with the story of how there were machinations behind the scenes to get Johnson out of town, to give him the presidency of the commissionership of the Western League. And then they, oh, we could wash our hands of this annoying journalist, only to turn around and watch Ban Johnson become a primary competitor in the near future. So those stories have the roots germinating there in 1892 with Murphy, Brush, Comiskey, and Ban Johnson all in Cincinnati at the same time as youngsters there. One of the things that Brush noticed about Murphy was, quite frankly, how different they were. Brush was a much more direct, much more abrasive figure, but he liked Murphy's energy. And so he enjoyed having Murphy around the ballpark as he covered the Reds. And eventually, I think it's 1902 thereabouts, Brush decides to sell his shares in the Reds and acquire the New York Giants, which is a whole story unto itself, of course. But on his way out the door, Brush says to Murphy, you know, I would like to take you along at some point. I'd like to bring you to New York because I think we can do well in business together. And Brush was an old clothing magnate. He had operated a store in Indianapolis, the Wenz store, and he was very passionate about marketing, and he would market through his ball clubs. So his baseball teams would, you know, wear uniforms that with the store's name on it. And so that was absolutely a part of what Brush wanted to do, combine marketing with a business and his ball club. And he thought Murphy could help him. And so eventually they have this conversation. Brush leaves for New York, and Murphy's thinking about, okay, that's a possibility. And in the meantime, he's become a very popular writer with the Inquirer, and Charles Phelps Taft has taken notice of this. And Taft, at that point, had just recently purchased two papers with his father-in-law and combined them into one called the Cincinnati Times-Star. And in 1902, Taft lures Murphy away from the Inquirer to write for the Times-Star. And that was the beginning of another really crucial business relationship and also personal friendship for Charlie Murphy. So he spends a couple of years writing for Taft, and then Brush comes calling. And Brush comes calling in 1905, and he says, hey, come work for me out in New York and be a press agent for us. You know, you're going to market the club. You're going to be ahead of the team on the road and make sure we've got stories in the paper. Let's get attendance boosted, things of this nature. Murphy jumps at the opportunity. And in this whirlwind couple of years, he goes from being a crime beat reporter at the Inquirer to working for Taft to being employed by the New York Giants. And so it's an amazing story in a short amount of time, and it only accelerates faster because as the 1905 calendar turns to 1906, as the 1904 calendar turns to 1905, Murphy is getting to know people throughout baseball. And one of the key relationships that he builds is with Jim Hart, who at the time was the president of the Chicago Cubs. So midway through the 1905 season, Murphy is in Chicago to promote the Giants in an upcoming series there at the West Side grounds. And Murphy and Hart have a conversation, and Hart goes, you're not going to believe this, but the team's going to be put up for sale. Our owner's in some legal trouble. He's got to raise cash quickly. And the fastest way for him to generate liquidity is to sell the club. And Charlie, well, how much is it gonna cost? What's the dollar amount here? And he says $100,000. And Murphy can't believe it. And so Murphy bolts down to Cincinnati, tells Charles Phillips Taft, this is the opportunity of a lifetime. And Taft fronts him the money, and they buy the Chicago Cubs for $100,000 with another $5,000 thrown in there as a bonus for Hart. So it's really an amazing tale. And John Walsh needed that money and was facing not just local and state charges, but federal charges too. And that's essentially how Murphy and Taft became overnight owners of the Chicago Cubs in a scenario you'd never see today. I think one of the things that's most unique about the story is at this point, Taft says, I really don't want anything to do with it. He liked baseball well enough, but he had an eye on Murphy the whole time to be the president of the club and to run it himself. So both Brush and Taft, who as human beings had absolutely nothing in common in terms of personality, both simultaneously viewed Murphy as a guy who could really help their ball club be more successful. And so as I thought about that, one of the things I began to try to focus on is exploring ways in which Murphy's newspaper coverage had promoted baseball. How is it that Brush and Taft, who are so different, reached the same conclusion? Yes, they had personal relationships, but they were savvy enough. They wanted to see metrics. They wanted to see evidence. And I think one of the things that really jumped out at me is if one goes back and looks back at some of the old Enquirer and Times Star archives, you can see that Charlie Murphy, as a journalist, promoted the sport in the off season. And so the winter meetings he would travel to, he would make sure that President Nick Young opened up the doors to the owners' conference room and let them in so that they could interview the various baseball officials and write those off-season stories. And so Murphy never wanted to give away a headline to college football, and he certainly wanted to make sure that baseball was in the news 12 months out of the year. And so that is absolutely a tangible metric that both Taft and Brush had seen that they wanted to use for their clubs. And Murphy at that point was really thought extremely highly of. He was actually considered for a front office role in New York for the National League, but instead it went to Harry Pulliam. Harry Pulliam was hired to be the president of the National League and also to take over several other duties. And so Pulliam and Murphy kind of had that tension over who was going to get the job, and it went to Pulliam, and the two of them didn't get along great at times. And I think one of the things that you see consistently throughout Murphy's life, even at this young age, you see this skyrocketing trajectory, yes, but you also see how his dedication, his overzealous dedication at times, commitment to writing about the sport year round, to giving quotes to the press, being available, all news is good news. PR should be at the top of our list. You see how this strategy or this mindset starts to really ruffle the feathers of those who have been in the game for a while. And that's where, at least for the title anyway, the word iconoclast kept jumping out at me. Showman, obviously, that comes from Fullerton, as I mentioned earlier, but he really went against the grain in terms of popularity and how do we talk about these different topics? How do we get people to read about them? And really a fascinating guy in that regard. So all that to say that in the middle of 1905, Murphy's become the president or the vice president of the Chicago Cubs. Hart remains on as president for about 6 more months, and then the transition is complete at the winter meetings. It's a whirlwind for Murphy, and he's got this young manager, Frank Chance. It brings us to really a key relationship in the book, Murphy and Frank Chance. Frank Chance had a very, very eventful 1905 season. Frank Seeley had managed the club. He had developed the young double play combination. He had been responsible for a lot of the scouting. And unfortunately, he had taken ill late in the year, about 60% of the way through the year, and Chance had been named the interim manager. And so one of Murphy's first really big decisions, crucial decisions in his new role in the front office of the Cubs is what to do with Frank Chance. And they meet They have a discussion about their ideas for the future. And Murphy is 100% convinced that Frank Chance is the guy. So not only does he offer Chance a multi-year contract, he actually offered him 10% of the team. He offered to make him a minority owner so that they would not just be boss and employee, they would be partners. They would share a partnership together. And so that partnership was incredibly important in those early years. Chance accepted the contract, became a minority owner of the club, and off they went. It was a really important offseason for the Cubs. The young players were getting better, but they wanted to compete for a World Series championship. That's all Murphy cared about. And certainly that's all Chance cared about. And so they made three really interesting moves in that offseason. One of them, which really won over Frank Chance permanently as a believer in Murphy's ability, at least in those early years. One of the trades was for Pat Moran, a backup catcher. Another one was for Harry Steinfeld to play third base. They acquired him from Cincinnati. So Steinfeld completed he's the answer to the trivia question, who played with Evers, Chance, and Tinker as Harry Steinfeld. And then they also, Murphy made a trade to acquire Jimmy Sheckard. And this was a blockbuster deal that shocked baseball. He had been in Brooklyn. He didn't really want to stay in Brooklyn. He wanted to be reunited with John McGraw, who was interested. The Pirates were also interested, but Murphy snuck in there and made a deal with Charlie Ebbets, to acquire Jimmy Sheckard. And it was at that moment that everybody realized that Murphy was incredibly serious about being successful as the owner of the Cubs. And he was very serious about competing for championships. And Murphy's quote was, "Hey, if Sheckard was good enough for New York and Pittsburgh, then he's certainly good enough to help make us better." But nobody saw it coming. I want to say off the top of my head, he shipped 5 players, and a significant chunk of money to Brooklyn in order to acquire Sheckard's rights. And at that time, it was a big haul. And many thought that Brooklyn had won the trade. But in the end, Sheckard and the Cubs had the last laugh. And that trade really, really, really impressed Frank Chance, because Chance, as he said to the media, he said, "We go to our owners all the time and ask for help at these certain positions, or give them the names of players we'd like to acquire. And a lot of them don't do it. But Murphy put his money where his mouth is and went out and got the exact guys we need to compete for a World Series championship." And of course, they would then win 3 consecutive pennants. One of the interesting things about that 3-year run are the role players. The nucleus is in place, as you all well know, but those role players turned out to be enormously influential in the Cubs' success. Moran, Steinfeld, Sheckard, Overall was another one. And the Cubs immediately became National League contenders. And obviously they lose to the Sox in 06, but then come back and beat the Tigers in 07 and 08. Just to touch briefly on a couple of things that happened, though, in 08. 1908 was a key year. Obviously, we know it as the last year until 16 that the Cubs win. But for Murphy, it was really, really, really the beginning of the end. And it was unfortunate for Murphy because he had a successful ownership tenure up until that point on the field. Off the field, in the business room, it was a little more contentious for sure. But there was a ticket scandal during the 1908 World Series where Cubs fans were not able to get tickets, and yet somehow they were in the hands of scalpers around town. And fans began to question how it was that took place. And even though over the years, the Cubs the front office members at least managed to craft some sort of narrative as to explain what exactly did happen, it was too late to save Murphy's reputation. He was blamed for the debacle, and there were a lot of fans who refused to attend the World Series games, and that boycott cost the players a lot of money in terms of their payout from the gate. And this caused a lot of dissension in the clubhouse. Frank Chance in particular was upset about it. And even though Chance had seen what Murphy could do in a positive light, he really took this scandal personally. And they had just agreed to another contract extension, but Chance wanted to see if that was renegotiable based on they had been in third place, then they had ended up winning the pennant. And then you combine it with the fact that he had to go back to the fellas in the clubhouse and tell them they obviously weren't going to receive as much money because the scandal had kept people away. And so the payout was going to be smaller. And tension starts to build intensely around the organization. And so you have a falling out. Murphy and Chance get into an intense screaming match in Murphy's office. And Chance says, that's it. I'm not coming back to the ball club. And so he comes back to California, Chance does, and he's decides that's it. I'm not going back. I'm done. I'm done with Chicago. That's the end of it. And Murphy, for his part, says, it's not that big a deal. We had some disagreements. Yeah, but it's not personal. Love Frank. He's still a minority owner, so he's part of this ownership group, and we'll work things out. But he underestimated Chance, or he just willfully ignored Chance, one of the two, because there was absolutely no way Frank Chance was going to just get over the perceived insults and the real insults that the scandal had caused, not just to him, but to the club. And so Chance returns to California, determined never to go back to the Cubs. And one of the things that happens is that Harry Pulliam, who's now the National League president, he goes out to visit Chance because at this point it's a National League problem. They don't want to lose one of their superstars, and Pulliam can perceive it as a problem. Pulliam tries to talk to Chance. He talks to him once or twice, a couple times, doesn't get anywhere. And so this story gets around Chicago pretty quickly. And Harvey Woodruff, who was editor, Chicago Tribune sports editor, had known both Murphy and Chance for a long time. He knew Chance since he was a teenager, first joined the organization. They had a good relationship. And so Harvey says, I'm going to go out to California and I'm going to talk to Frank and see if I can't figure out what's really going on. So he does. And long story short, he gets a hold of Murphy and he says, no, Chance is dead serious about this. And Murphy's like, it'll blow over. He didn't take it seriously enough. And it takes quite a bit of persuasion to get Chance to communicate with Murphy and vice versa. But once the two of them start to communicate via wire, they eventually patch things up well enough where Frank agrees to return to manage the team. And so he does come back in 1909, and he's there, as you well know, for a couple of more seasons before health and a falling out with Murphy ends that tenure there in Chicago, which is another wild ride of a story unto its own. But Woodruff should get a lot of credit for keeping Chance in Chicago, because without that mediation, Chance would not have returned to the Cubs before the 1909 season. So even though things on the surface looked patched up, the reality was the trust had been broken, at least as Chance saw it, and they were not on solid ground after that. Now, fast forward to working on this project, the question was, what do I do with that? Because that's kind of the part that's remembered, if anything, is that Murphy in the second half of his tenure alienated everybody. That's kind of the narrative. And to a large degree, it's true. And I try to be as transparent as possible about that and quote other people talking about him, particularly Charles Ebbets, being very critical about Murphy to his face in National League meetings. At the same time, though, does it mean we throw out the first half of his ownership tenure? Obviously not. So what happened? What changed? I think a couple of things changed. I think Murphy started to take some things for granted. I think he also compartmentalized as a person in a way that others didn't. And his ability to compartmentalize, while it helped him be successful in the early years in terms of keeping business and personal things, outside of business, it hurt his relationship with Chance because of the overlap for Frank. Everything was personal with Frank, as for a number of the guys in that clubhouse. And that's just the way they were. It's just a different personality. But that said, Murphy was able to pull off trades that other owners weren't able to pull off. He was able to support the team from a financial standpoint in the early years before the scandal in a way that was particularly unique. Chance's 10% ownership stake of the team skyrocketed in value, and fans flocked to the West Side grounds constantly to watch the team play. And so from a business perspective, things had gone really, really well, but this scandal broke trust. And after that, Murphy was always fighting an uphill battle to regain the trust. Now, did he actually, allow for the tickets to be scalped? I mean, evidence points to the fact that there probably was a reel of tickets that, ended up in the hands of scalpers that shouldn't. But how it happened or where it happened or when it happened, no one could figure out at the time, and certainly can't figure it out now, unfortunately, as much as I'd love to. Van Johnson was furious at Murphy, of course, because it hurt his American League team, it hurt the Tigers, and Murphy was censured for it. But Charlie Williams and Charlie Thomas, who were the two Cubs front office officials, they worked for several years after the fact to try to figure out what had happened. And later, Williams thought he figured out one of the possible solutions in terms of how people were getting hold of the tickets illegally that had nothing to do with them. But by then it was much too late to complicate the narrative. It had remained simplified, and that was that Murphy had allowed this to happen for financial gain. And that was the end of it. So after 1908, things start to change. The team's core is also getting older. And even though they return to the World Series in 1910, they do lose to the A's, of course. But at that point, the core is getting older and injuries are really, really, really starting to mount. And how Murphy, well, really the key to his lack of success later in his career was he starts to see that his core is getting older. And much like, I was thinking of Bill Walsh actually the other day. Bill Walsh would trade his guys regardless of how much success they'd had. He traded them a year too early rather than a year too late. Murphy was of the same mindset. He always paid them well. There was never really an issue in terms of contract or salary, but he was ruthlessly willing to trade his guys a year too early rather than a year too late. And so as he's turning the nucleus over, he only has one or two guys. Vic Sire had a couple of good years. One or two other guys were decent, but you could see pretty quickly that there was not a next generation of young players available to Chance to deploy to continue the success. And so at that point, the fans start to sour a little bit more and the public newspapers start to turn against him a little bit more. And he, at that point, with a stacking number of controversies, you really start to see the deck stacked against him. And no one knew that better than Murphy. He understood that. That said, it all culminates in the firing of Johnny Evers. Chance and Murphy do have a fallout. I don't want to get too much into that just for the sake of time, but they do have a fallout. Chance departs. He has a surgery, he has the headaches, and then he becomes, as his health improves, he becomes manager of the Yankees. And Murphy replaces him with Evers, which is really, that surprised me. I was really surprised he didn't tap Tinker. And I think as soon as Murphy tapped Evers, he regretted it. And then in the later years, he actually tried to get Tinker back into the organization and tried to make a trade for him when Tinker was moved from Cincinnati to Brooklyn. But Evers, from a temperamental standpoint, offended Charles Phelps Taft. Taft did not like Evers managing the club, did not like the ejections, did not like the temperament. Murphy didn't mind that as much, but his problem was, he said at one point to Evers, I've got you on two contracts. One as a manager and one as a second baseman. And when you get ejected, I'm paying you to do two things that you're not doing either one because you've been run. So at that point, Murphy decides to fire Evers after the 1913 season, but you have the Federal League competing with the National League at that point for attention, for PR, and for players. And the other National League owners know that if Evers is fired by Murphy, that he is basically fair game to Charlie Wiegman and the Federal League if they want to sign him. And so at that point in a series of meetings, they tell Charles Phelps Taft, look, Murphy's got to go because now he's given a competitive edge to the Federal League. And he's interested in hiring a former umpire to manage the team and all this stuff. And it's too much, and he's got to go. And Ban Johnson was really of the mindset that he had to do everything he could to get rid of Murphy. And so, long story short, they do oust Murphy. Murphy sells the club back to Taft, who then pivots and negotiates with Weigman. They have some stops and starts, but Weigman eventually gets a hold of the club. The unique part of that deal, though, was that Murphy still had not been paid out and still owned a significant number of shares. He still possessed them and hadn't been paid out yet. And so there were a number of stops and starts with Weigman. And then when Weigman does finally acquire the club, Murphy still was able to be involved a little bit on the edges because he hadn't been paid out yet. And there's even a moment where once he is, the deal is culminated, Murphy buys back into the club. And it just gets real weird real quick. I remember talking to Ed Hardig a couple months ago, and we were trying to sort out who owned the shares when, and it turned into a hot mess real quick. But Ed was really dialed into who owned them when, but Murphy owned most of them, and then they were distributed, and then Weigman had them, and then there were a few other minority stakeholders as well. So with Murphy out of the game in 1914, he returns home to Wilmington. He builds a musical theater for his patrons, for his residents of the hometown to enjoy his patrons. It still stands today. It opened in 1918, a couple years ago, 4 years ago. Now it was the 100th anniversary. You can still go visit it. And Murphy was really incredibly proud of that theater. He remained a Cubs fan throughout his life. He would return to Chicago. He lived in Chicago for a while, and then he traveled around the U.S., spent some time in California and in the South, but he would return to Chicago in the summer, and he would go to the new ballpark, Wrigley Field, and watch the Cubs and always cheered for them. Murphy never had anything to do with Wrigley, though. His entire existence is a pre-Wrigley part of Cubs history. And I do think that's part of, to some extent, what works against him in terms of narrative over the years. Obviously, the West Side ground's no longer there. It's part of the Illinois Medical Center. Murphy made two really, really ingenious deals during his time as the owner. One was acquiring that land, which he then sold off to the Illinois Medical Center, which is the situation today. And then another one that's a long tail in the book is that he got involved with Taft with a Philadelphia ball club and syndicate baseball. And the syndicate baseball controversy involved Horace Fogel, who he hired to be a front man to be a president of the Philadelphia club. And they tried to manipulate some voting in the front office there to control the commissioner's office. Well, not the commissioner's office, but the presidential office in the pre-commission days. And part of that had to do with John Brush, who was getting older and had lost some power, but wanted to retain his hold on the National League. But quickly he saw it slipping away. So Brush and Murphy tried to retain some of that, but were unable to. So Murphy passed away in 1931, and he died in Chicago. He didn't have any children. So as far as research, he was a writer, a prolific writer as a journalist, but there are very few, next to none, but very few personal papers remain. You have to look in the archives of other people that he would have sent them to in order to find them. So the Gary Herman archives at Cooperstown were absolutely essential to completing this project because Gary kept everything. And so that's where most of Charlie's letters, at least to Gary, went. They're still in Cooperstown there in Herman's archive. But as far as Charlie's materials himself, unfortunately, they're long gone. And it's one of the unfortunate parts. And one of the reasons why I think Murphy hadn't been written on before, actually, is that the personal papers weren't there. So those are just some basic kind of high level events in Murphy's life and the project itself. So I'll turn it back over to Bill and happy to answer any questions or chat about any of the topics mentioned. So thanks again.
Sure. Well, thanks. Steve Dunn actually threw in a couple of questions back to back. He said he wrote the bio of Del Howard, a key reserve on those pennant winning years, the teams. He said, do you have any thoughts about him? And he also said, it sounds like Charlie Murphy is a little bit like William Wrigley. And again, you mentioned there was no overlap with the two of them, but is he correct? And just their views on marketing and acquiring talent. specifically, he mentioned Hornsby.
Yeah, Howard was a key Howard is a great example of those important depth pieces. And Murphy was really attuned to those depth pieces in no small part, even though in 1905, he only spent about 6 months with the New York Giants after Brush had hired him to be the press agent. Murphy intentionally sought out John McGraw to sit down with him and talk about strategy, several types of strategy. Number one, in-game strategy. Murphy wanted to know everything McGraw was thinking and why he was thinking it. The second thing he wanted to talk about with McGraw was roster construction. And so McGraw was pretty transparent with Murphy at times with how he went about building his rosters. At one point, it sounds simple to us, but at one point, Murphy relayed the story about how McGraw emphasized repeatedly, you have to have a balance of right-handed and left-handed hitters in your lineup because you don't know who you're going to face, so on and so forth. But the story just simply reflected Murphy's relationship with McGraw and how he sought him out to understand those strategies. And one of the things that was emphasized to Charlie in that 6-month period was the depth pieces. So it's not just the double play combo and Brown, it's the rule box, it's the Howards, it's the overalls, it's the Steinfeldts, it's the Pat Morans. And when the team started to get beat up, these depth pieces got a lot of playing time. When Johnny Kling sits out the 1909 season, Pat Moran plays, and they're still fairly competitive, although injuries to Chance really did hurt them that year. And as far as the marketing, absolutely, it's really interesting. I think Murphy's gotten lost, but he's one of the early intense marketers. And so a lot of owners that came in the decades thereafter, a lot of the things that they did reflected what Murphy had done during his tenure. I know one of the things he did is he intentionally built like the largest ever. So the largest scoreboard advertisement ever that featured publications there in town, he would put on the scoreboard. He really thought that fans wanted to know about other games that were going on. And so he said, let's get a scoreboard up in the outfield so we can tell our fans there what's happening in the other games. And so you have the out of town scoreboard. And so you have a number of these things that he also thought about putting numbers on the back of jerseys, but he was talking to Richter, who ran Sporting News, Sporting Life. It eludes me at this moment in time, but he was saying, I'm going to put numbers on the back of the jerseys, but I forgot about it. And so he was constantly looking at ways of doing that. And his mind moved so fast. And he had so many ideas that half of what he thought of, he forgot. But absolutely, yes, it's a great example of those genius marketers. And he thought that was just as important part of his job as anything else.
What other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself. Just going back through the chat, I didn't see anything else. So
good.
Well, perfect. Well, thank you very much. And again, it was a fascinating book. And again, kind of going back to my original comment, it's just Murphy, again, was such a critical component of that era of Cubs baseball that just seems like even the team hasn't really embraced him, looking back. So, yeah.
It's interesting you say that. I've asked people, around the organization, some of them didn't even know who he was.
Right.
And no fault of their own in particular, but none of his materials were in the archives or anything like that. And he's just a guy who just slipped through the cracks. So kind of an interesting deal for sure, but it was a lot of fun, and the organization had been really supportive of the project. So it's been a lot of fun. So.
Perfect. Excellent. And so there's a question, what's the best way to buy your book?
Oh, sure. A couple options. Nebraska Press website. I can throw a link in there in just a minute. Nebraska Press is great. You've got some independent bookstores around the country, Scott, that hopefully could ship. River Lights, Square Books, a couple of those guys, or the Behemoth's got it for about 20% off, which isn't or 40, about $20 on the Behemoth. So that one too, but I'll throw a link in there.
Okay, perfect.
Thanks for asking. That's very kind of you.
Excellent. So what are you working on next?
I am working currently on a dual biography of Billy Williams and Willie McCovey. So that is in full swing. They grew up, they were born the same year, 1938, debuted same year, 1959, same first name, both girl dads, no sons, both have their what ifs, 1962 for Willie Mack, 1969 for Sweet Swing and Billy. Both went in the Hall of Fame, well, 1 year apart Hall of Fame. So their lives have incredible trajectories. It's been a lot of fun. It was really incredible to sit down with Billy a couple weekends ago at Cooperstown when Buck O'Neill went into the Hall of Fame, and getting his thoughts on seeing Buck go in, and really amazing experience there. So I think people will enjoy it. He's got some great stories too about Willie and Billy used to sit on their front porch, the screened-in porch, with Billy's older brother Franklin as young teenagers on those hot summer Alabama nights, dreaming about their futures. And just a few years later, they were National League stars in two of the most influential cities in the world in the 1960s. So I think people will enjoy it.
Great, perfect. Well, unless there's any other questions, I will turn off the recording and we'll just turn it over to open discussion. I know Mark mentioned he'd stick around and talk a little bit more of big picture SABR questions. I guess I have to jump in and say that my renewal was due next week. So as of this morning, I am renewed for another 3 years. So glad to be back in the fold again for another run. So. Perfect. So yeah, I will stop the recording and we'll just have open discussion.